Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are about to decode a 1,000-year-old political survival guide, and honestly, it is nothing short of fascinating. We're looking at a brilliant administrative blueprint from the 11th century, a framework created during a time of just massive political upheaval. Our source material today breaks down exactly how a medieval Islamic state was structured. And as we go through these functions, I think you're going to be stunned by how much of this ancient organizational chart mirrors the exact way our modern world is run today. It's really incredible.
Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine for a second being the absolute ruler of a vast empire, right? Yet you've essentially become a hostage in your own palace. No way to live. But this was the dramatic, real-life reality for the Abbasid caliphs in the 10th and 11th centuries. They held the grand title, sure, but behind the scenes, their actual executive power had been entirely stripped away by rival military commanders and regional emirs. The caliphs were basically figureheads, trapped in this highly unstable political environment where they reigned, but they absolutely did not rule. And this decline? It happened shockingly fast. Back in 940 CE, Caliph Al-Mawardi was the last independent Abbasid caliph to actually direct the army and the finances. Fast forward just 5 years later, the Buyid Emirate rose up in Baghdad, established their own authority, and reduced the caliph's domain to basically just his palace grounds. Then, by 1055 CE, the Seljuk sultans had marched in and completely taken over the executive power. As the famous historian Ibn Khaldun so vividly noted, the caliphs were eventually in control of an area smaller than the ring around the moon. Their authority had literally shrunk to almost nothing. So what do? How do you fix a completely broken chain of command? Well, enter Al-Mawardi. He was a highly respected jurist, a diplomat, and a chief justice who actually lived through all this turmoil. Near the end of his life, he wrote a famous book called Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, which translates to The Rules of Governance. Now you gotta understand, this wasn't some abstract, head-in-the-clouds philosophical text. It was a highly practical, desperately needed rulebook written specifically to help Caliph al-Qaim claw back his legitimate executive authority from the emirs and sultans who had usurped it. But before laying out the exact nuts and bolts of government, Al-Mawardi had to establish the ideological baseline. What actually is a caliph, and how is that different from a typical king? The source shares this great anecdote about the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. He once asked his companions if he was a caliph or a king, noting that being a king is a tremendous matter. His companion replied that a caliph only takes what is due and spends it in the right way, bound strictly by justice. A king, on the other hand, rules by personal whim, treating people unjustly, taking from one and giving to another. This distinction, ruling by the justice of the Sharia rather than just arbitrary, absolute tyranny, is exactly why Al-Mawardi's rules were so vital.
And this brings us to our core focus for today's explainer. To make this justice a reality, to actually build it into the system, Al-Mawardi outlined what he called al-wilayat al-khassa, the specific government functions. He identified 20 distinct functions, or wilayat, necessary to run the state. We're going to translate these 20 medieval Arabic functions into their modern equivalents, breaking them down into the branches of government we easily recognize today.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly this medieval framework maps onto modern executive leadership. At the top, you have the imam, which is the caliph or the head of state. Directly below that is the delegated minister, essentially the prime minister or deputy caliph, someone who has broad authority to act on the caliph's behalf. Then you have the executive minister, acting exactly like a modern executive office or chief of staff, carrying out direct orders. And finally, the emirate in the provinces, acting just like modern-day state or provincial governors. It's a highly structured federal leadership system. Moving on to defense and administration, we see the state managed both external military defense and internal security with, honestly, incredible precision. The Emirate of Jihad functioned as the commander-in-chief or defense secretary, handling the armed forces and all those external threats. But distinct from that was the command of wars waged for the public good. That's basically your modern Department of Homeland Security or Home Affairs, focused purely on keeping the internal peace. And running the day-to-day bureaucracy of all this, that was the Diwan, encompassing all the various executive departments and civil service administration. Now, the judicial branch is where this framework genuinely shines in its commitment to accountability. You have the standard administration of the judiciary, kind of like a justice department, and your standard criminal courts. But the true brilliance here is the judicial redress, or the Mazalim court. It functioned like a Supreme Court specifically designed to hear complaints against the government itself. Think about that. If a governor or a tax collector was oppressing the people, the Mazalim was the institution that held those powerful government officials accountable to the public. So the crucial question is, how did they pay for all this?
Al-Mawardi outlines the economic engines of the state, managed by the treasury, known as the Bait-ul-Mal. And this wasn't just some simple piggy bank or basic tax collection agency. It had highly specialized divisions. The administration of the Sadaqat handled mandatory charity and wealth distribution to the poor. Other departments, like the division of Fay and Ganima and the imposition of jizya and kharaj, handled really complex state taxation and revenue from different types of lands and citizens. They even had a dedicated grants and concessions office to manage state property and funding. And this brilliantly illustrates the depth of their civic planning. They didn't just collect taxes, they had a full-scale Department of Agriculture explicitly for reviving dead lands and drawing water. They had another for reserves and common lands, operating just like modern housing and urban development for zoning. The Hisba maintained public order in the markets, basically acting as consumer protection inspectors and ombudsmen. And of course, they had specialized departments for managing massive logistical events like the Hajj pilgrimage and the Department of Mosques and Imams.
Now, looking at that highly organized list of 20 functions, you might be scratching your head a bit wondering, but wait, where is consultation? Where is the shura? Did the people actually have a voice in this 11th century state, or was it purely top-down? And hey, it's a very fair question. If you look closely at Al-Mawardi's list, you're going to notice there is no single institution called a Majlis al-Shura or a modern parliament listed.
To understand this, we have to grasp a critical nuance from the source text. Shura is a fundamental Islamic principle of mutual consultation. It's a guiding principle that underpins the entire state apparatus, rather than a single fixed institution or a specific building you can point to. Because it's an underlying principle, sort of the DNA of the government, it was expected to be practiced throughout the state, rather than just isolated to one single committee.
So how did shura actually work in action in Al-Mawardi's model?
Well, consultation lived primarily within the Wizarate, that tight circle of the caliph's closest advisors and ministers, who were rigorously vetted for their wisdom, experience, and refined manners. Furthermore, consultation was the absolute core duty of the Ahel Haliwal Act, which translates to those who loosen and bind. This was an electoral council of just, insightful, and knowledgeable leaders, whose specific job was to consult and choose the most fitting person to become the caliph.
It's also super important to provide some necessary historical context right here. The idea of mass public voting, it simply didn't exist in the 11th century, anywhere in the world. The logistical mechanisms just weren't there. So consultation naturally relied on representatives and elite advisors. To put this in perspective, our source reminds us that even in the 19th century United States, as late as 1835, voting was heavily restricted. In a lot of states, you had to be a wealthy, property-owning man with a specific amount of acreage or capital just to cast a ballot. Universal suffrage is a very, very recent global phenomenon.
Yet, despite the lack of modern voting booths, the foundational structure of the state was surprisingly representative. The Islamic State operates as a unitary executive, but the ultimate source of that authority, the Masdar al-Sulta, is the Ummah, the people themselves. Power flows from the people to the caliph through a strict contract called the Bay'ah. The people grant the caliph executive power, but only on the strict condition that he rules them according to the Sharia. If he violates that law, the contract is broken. It's that simple.
Let's move to end and see how this builds into a functioning government without the caliph losing control again. Because the caliph is responsible for all his subjects, he obviously has to delegate. But remember, the whole reason Al-Mawardi wrote this book, caliphs had over-delegated and lost their power. So Al-Mawardi carefully categorized delegated officials into 4 safe types. First, officials with general powers across all provinces, like prime ministers. Second, those with general powers in a specific province, like governors. Third, those with specific powers across all provinces, like a chief judge or commander-in-chief. And fourth, those with specific powers in specific districts, like local tax collectors. This brilliant matrix allowed the caliph to run the 20 functions efficiently without accidentally giving away the keys to the kingdom again.
Ultimately, what distinguishes this governing structure from just any other empire in history, it's the underlying ideology. As the historian Anne K.S. Lambton perfectly summarizes in our source text, the basis of the Islamic State was ideological, not political, territorial, or ethnical, and the primary purpose of government was to defend and protect the faith, not the state. This is the bedrock of Al-Mawardi's entire structural blueprint. The administration exists to serve justice and uphold the divine law, not merely to enrich the ruler.
So, looking back at these 20 distinct functions, from the Department of Agriculture and Housing to the Supreme Court of Judicial Redress, right down to the executive branches and Homeland Security, how much of this 1,000-year-old blueprint do you recognize in our modern bureaucracies today? It is truly incredible to see how the mechanics of a complex, just, and accountable government were so clearly mapped out a millennium ago. It definitely leaves you wondering how our current administrative systems will be viewed 1,000 years from now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking great questions, and I'll catch you next time.